Picking up on the theme for today, the first Sunday of 2014. How many of you wrote down 2013? Somewhere, sometime? Yes? Anyone? Caught yourself? Little bit of transition, a little bit of change. It's a new year, and it's impossible for something to be new unless it's different. And if something's going to be different, that means that it has to change, right? And that's a big part of our mission statement that we developed together back in 2008. We're here to help people to thrive in the face of a rapidly changing world. And we do that by learning, teaching, and applying spiritual principles. So, if we want to live in the midst of change, I think a good first step is to acknowledge it, to embrace it, and to look and see all the ways that the world is changing, and then gauge our reaction to what it is that we see. It's always good to start with a little self-awareness and a little self-check. So as we start 2014 here at Unity of Auburn, I'd like to share a brief 4-minute video that I think captures for us all of the ways that the world is changing in ways that perhaps we wouldn't have even recognized as short a time as 10 years ago. Let's watch.
I wanna feel the sun, have barbecues. I wanna see my friends, the old and new. We'll turn on the game and share some laughs, and we'll play this and that. Now we'll say goodbye to rainy days, to the colder nights and the empty trees, not full of life and colors new, and it's all here for you to see. Cloudless sky, summer days, feels just like in some way. Kids are out, safe to play, and it feels just like a beautiful day. Cloudless sky, summer days, feels just like in some way. Kids are out, safe to say, it feels just like a beautiful day. A beautiful day. Beautiful day. A beautiful day. Beautiful day. La da 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 da. I wanna feel the grass between my toes. I wanna hear the birds as they come and go. And I love to fly if I had wings, and I bring you with me. I wanna hit the beach, the ocean air, and we'll let the sand get everywhere. We'll watch the sun as it melts away, and I smile just the same with you. Cloudless sky, summer days, feels just like it's somewhere. Kids are out, safe to play, it feels just like a beautiful day. Cloudless sky, summer days, feels just like it's somewhere. Kids are out, safe to say, it feels just like a beautiful day. A beautiful day. Beautiful day. Beautiful day. Beautiful day. La da 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 la da. Feels just like it's somewhere. Kids are out, safe to play, and it feels just like a beautiful day. Cloudless sky, summer days, feels just like it's somewhere. Kids are out, safe to say, but it feels just like a beautiful day. A beautiful day. Beautiful day. A beautiful day. A beautiful day.
Yes. There was no soundtrack with that last part. That was just to drive those very important, important words home to us. I like change. I'm not so sure about court notices on Facebook exactly, but the message here, though, is that the world is changing faster than ever, but we don't have to let it leave us behind. Change isn't a threat. It's an opportunity. Generation Y is giving us an opportunity. I hope that Generation Y succeeds in that thing that they showed up there. What would it be like if our entire culture was like Generation Y and valued relationships more than money? How great would that be? You know, every time a new generation comes along, I'm rooting for them. I want to see them turn things upside down, and somehow they never quite get it done, but parts of it do get done, and that's something I'd really, really like to see. So change is nothing to fear. Yeah, there may be some bumps in the road, but the road can lead to a good place if we're resilient. There's an author who described this kind of accelerating change this way. He calls it living in deep shift. Now, you have to be mindful when you say that, because if you're not, it could result in a Freudian slip, which might actually reveal what you really think about change. You want to be careful. You want to be careful that you don't Freudian slip in the shift, as they say. So you got to be careful. But I think that really hits it. We are in some deep shift. And the author who wrote this is a fellow named Brian McLaren, who wrote this book up here called Everything Must Change: Jesus, Global Crisis, and a Revolution of Hope. He is an evangelical Christian minister, a guy who was raised in a very conservative Christian family, who became disillusioned as he reached adulthood, became disillusioned with traditional Christianity, and began to realize that these younger generations with the names, the Generation Y, the Millennials, and so on, were going through the same thing. They were sharing some of the same disillusionment that he was experiencing. They were all asking the same kind of questions. Questions like, how is it that Jesus' message got turned into a ticket to heaven or a formula for getting rich? How come the only moral issues that the Christian right can talk about are abortion, homosexuality, and putting Christian prayer in public schools? When they talk about putting prayer in public schools, they're talking about Christian prayer. Another question: when did Jesus ever demonize or hate any one person or group of people? Other questions: what about things like poverty, war, disease, injustice, oppression? Aren't those moral issues too? And why aren't our national evangelical leaders, or even our national and international religious leaders, talking about those issues? Now, that was back in 2008 when all of those questions began to emerge. What's changed since then? What's changed since then? Well, how about this guy today? I find it interesting. You want to talk about an international religious leader who is starting to hit these issues head on in ways that we haven't heard before. There is change happening, and the message is that it's not about salvation, somewhere off in heaven after we die. It's not about rigid conformity to a set of rules or complex ideologies and things like that. It's about finding ways to bring more and more people together. I could use the word unity, to bring more people into unity with a small u or a capital U. That works too. Bringing people together so that we can create a more compassionate, peaceful, and just world right here and now. Jesus was pretty clear. He didn't say that the kingdom of heaven was someplace in the future at a distant place, he said that it's among us right here and now. And that was 2014 some odd years ago that he said that, and it's still true today. Deep shift, indeed. So what we're witnessing is an emerging view of Jesus, spirituality, Christianity. The idea is that despite the fact that, and we have to admit this, human beings have made some pretty poor choices, yet despite the poor choices that we've made, there's nothing that cannot be changed or reversed if we're willing to wake up. It isn't about trying to avoid hell in the afterlife. It's about creating the kingdom of heaven, the kind of place we all want to live in the present moment here on this planet. Now, way back, again, back to the first century, someone else picked up on this idea that we find in the teachings of Jesus, this fellow named Paul, and he had a very simple statement that he wrote in this letter to the Romans. He said this, he said, Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Do not be conformed, but be transformed, and it all starts at the level of mind, changing the way that we think. Don't give in to the status quo. Don't think that we have to accept the world the way it is. You know, so often, don't we do this? We do things because, well, that's the way we've always done it. It's the way it's always been done. As if that alone is a good enough reason to keep doing something that really doesn't seem to be working anymore, or doesn't really serve us, or doesn't really serve all people. It's like the story of, there's a story in the Bible that illustrates this from the Hebrew Scriptures. The story of the Israelites following Moses out of slavery in Egypt. A perfect example of how this works. They were slaves in Egypt. He's leading them to freedom. As soon as they get into unfamiliar territory, and there's a little bit of a, should I say, change required, things start to look unfamiliar and they get a little bit uncomfortable. What do? They start grumbling. They start grumbling. They say, hey, we may have been slaves back there, but at least we had decent food. We had 3 meals. We had a roof over our heads, you know. They wanted to go back. They were physically free. But in consciousness, it's a whole different story. Physically free, but in consciousness, they were still in shackles. They were anything but free. They were still slaves. The transformation hadn't taken hold yet. They were still conformed to the world as they had known it. No transformation taking place because everything was the same at the level of mind. Freedom is scary. Freedom requires us to challenge even our most cherished assumptions and then open up to new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking about the world. And we need some new ways of thinking about the world. As we can see from that video, all of the challenges that lie ahead is going to take new ways of thinking. Just this last Friday, when I was preparing for this talk, I came across another recent gem from that guy I mentioned before, Pope Francis. Goes along with this idea of getting away from ideology. Here's the quote. This is from a Jesuit weekly publication. He said this. He said, I am convinced of one thing. The great changes in history were realized when reality was seen not from the center, but rather from the periphery. It is not a good strategy to be at the center of a sphere. To understand, we ought to move around, to see reality from various viewpoints. We ought to get used to thinking. Wow. I mean, and there's a lot more to the article, but there really is a message here that we need to stop thinking of ourselves as the center of a sphere and everything else revolves around us. We need to get out and experience more of the points that are part of that sphere and to ponder it and to think about it again, changing at the level of consciousness, changing at the level of mind. He's telling us to take multiple perspectives, and that's really something that is missing in the world, is this sense of perspective, is having a sense of perspective. Lack of perspective is what keeps us rigid and anxious, because we're trying to hold on to the one thing that we're certain is right, and when that's threatened in any way, we tense up, we get anxious. One of the things that really caught my attention in that video, and I heard a few murmurings out there in the audience, was that part about how children today experience anxiety levels that would have resulted in a psychiatric diagnosis back in the 1950s. That doesn't sound healthy. And it's just another reason why we need to be able to take multiple perspectives about our mission, which is to thrive in a changing world, not just survive. Change will bring about anxiety. And if all we're trying to do is to manage our anxiety in the face of change, then we're just going to be stuck in our survival mode. And that ain't thriving. We need to do better than that. Now, at another spot in the video, it said, and I think I have the slide up here, it said, "Never in our history has it been more important to develop one's emotional intelligence." I'm not sure that a majority of people watching that video would know what emotional intelligence is. But it's something we've been working with extensively here at Unity of Auburn. Last January, we started an 8-part series on the topic of spiritual intelligence, which includes emotional intelligence and expands on it. We've been working with this stuff for a long time. Spiritual intelligence is a skill set that will enable people to thrive in the face of change. That's what it's all about. All right, so back to the video. The last 3 frames that kind of sum things up. Say goodbye to the world you thought you lived in. This world is wild, crazy, and fantastic. Well, it can be that way for those who embrace change. So, that's why we teach spiritual intelligence, which includes emotional intelligence, because that's what helps us to embrace change. That's why Jesus taught spiritual intelligence. In fact, when people are asked to identify the attributes of a great spiritual teacher, these are the things that show up: authenticity, integrity, calm, peaceful, centered, clear mission, compassion, caring, kindness, loving, courageous, dependable, faithful, faith-filled, forgiving, generous, leadership, good teacher, good mentor, humble, inspiring, wise, nonviolent, open-minded, committed to serving others. And that list can go on and on. And these are attributes that were identified as a result of some extensive surveys. This was done by some pretty rigorous research that were done as part of that book we used last year called The 21 Skills of Spiritual Intelligence. And what the author concluded from all of this is that every one of us knows how to recognize a fuller and higher expression of humanity when we see one. We know spiritual intelligence when we see it. So the really good news is that because we know it when we see it, it's something we can aspire to. It's not just for saints and avatars and people like that. It's for every one of us, because we're born with the capacity to do this. We don't have to be like the Israelites, wandering in the wilderness, wishing we were still slaves because, well, that's the way it always used to be, and that was pretty darn comfortable. Is the world wild, crazy, and fantastic? Or is it scary, forbidding, and sinister? The great spiritual leaders tell us that it's all up to us. Now, last week I talked about all of the evidence that we can draw from the world around us to support the conclusion that things have really been changing for the better. This week, we're going to make a commitment at the level of consciousness to embrace our innate capacity to express those attributes that we listed earlier. The attributes of our great spiritual leaders. Because if things are going to keep improving, if we want to continue to thrive in the face of accelerating change, instead of just trying to manage our anxiety, if we want to thrive, then cultivating spiritual intelligence, cultivating those attributes are among the best ways that we can do that starting out the new year. Now, remember the definition of spiritual intelligence, and if you don't, I'll remind us of it here. Spiritual intelligence is the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner and outer peace, regardless of the situation. So, in keeping with the theme of change, some of you might have noticed that we decided to change the order of service a little bit. In fact, today was your first test with dealing with change. And if you found yourself a little bit anxious and a little bit, oh my God, where did the meditation go? Where did the meditation go? You're in the right place here today. This was a test. It was an easy one. Y'all get an A. Karen is now going to lead us in a New Year's ritual that we do here at Unity of Auburn called a White Stone Ceremony, which is all about embracing the new. It's all about embracing change. So